Welcome to the Brave Feminine Leadership podcast. I'm Melissa Hamilton. I'm a former global CEO who led 5,000 people. I'm a company director, and these days I work with executives and CEOs and spend a lot of time thinking deeply about influence and leadership and what actually moves people. Over the last few years, I've had conversations with over 250 leaders. And one thing became clear: the strategic imperative of people leadership has never been more critical. And that's why today I'm in conversation with chief people officers. The CHRO function has fundamentally shifted. It's no longer a support function, it's strategic. These leaders sit at the centre of leadership, culture, and long term performance with a unique view of how executives are shaped over time. So today I'm very curious about Amy Walker's journey, about the moments that shaped how she leads, and what she's navigating right now as she helps build an organisation fit for what's coming next. Amy, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks for having me.
Let me share your bio. So, Amy Walker is a globally experienced Chief People and Culture Executive with over 20 years leading transformation in some of Australia's most complex, traditionally male dominated industries, from manufacturing and logistics to clean energy and maritime. Currently serving as Chief People, Culture, Safety, Environment and Governance Officer at the Port of Newcastle, Amy is helping guide one of the country's most significant organisational diversification transitions. Previously, as CHRO at Visy, a 4 billion plus global operation, she led a workforce of 10,000 employees across multiple continents, delivering people strategy through high growth and high pressure environments. You have a fascinating background and a fascinating career. Amy, I would love to ask you as our first question, who are you as a human being? So take us back to how you found your way into these roles and parts of the journey that make sense now that might not at the beginning. So over to you.
Sure. Look, I got into HR by quite a fluke, really. I was giving a friend a lift home from uni, and he had an HR lecture to attend. And rather than sit outside and wait for him, I went in there um, and absolutely loved it. That ended up in staying an extra year or 18 months at university to get across some more of the HR and IR function. I decided I'd better do a little bit of work experience and really make sure that was what I wanted to do before I stepped out of university and the help of mum and dad. So I went and did sort of a 6 month placement. Realized that I absolutely loved it. It was one of the true functions that where you really do have your finger in the pie end to end in any business, any supply chain. And you really had to know, you had to understand the strategy as well as the granular to be truly effective. So, you know, really ticked all those boxes for me. I had a short stint in Stanford Hotels and Resorts, which was a great way to cut my teeth in those very sort of low margin
Mm.
environments. You really do get to be all things to all people. That was fabulous, but I did miss, I guess, the complexity of manufacturing supply chain. So I went and did a course, a short course at Apex in manufacturing supply chain management, and from there went over to TNT Logistics, which I absolutely loved. You basically go into other people's businesses where, supply chain management isn't their core function. You take a look at that with some industrial engineers and help create people strategies, industrial relations instruments that help typically, rigid and environments that aren't quite so well performing, and help turn those around through, cultural change, a whole set of, tools and what have you that you are bringing everyone along on the journey. And I absolutely love that. We went in and out of many businesses, Mitsubishi Motors, Komatsu, Telstra. I could go on. Just a brilliant environment. And from there, I never thought I would leave, but from there, I got a call from Visy, and a far more complex and industrial space that really went across multiple businesses, very siloed businesses, with a large degree of industrial instruments, very different operating environments. and a business that had plans to go global. Um, and went from, I'm not very good with titles. I came in there in some sort of HR, IR function, I think, for Southern Region. And that was just an environment that was brilliant in terms of it didn't matter whether you were orange, pink, purple, so long as you could engage and influence and get results, the world was your oyster. It was wonderful. And along that journey, we got a particularly fabulous CEO, Mark DeWitt, who came along, who truly understood the value of a human resources function and brought me back from mat leave and basically said, Amy, I want this to be more than IR. I want a true HR function, build a strategy, take me through a roadmap, take the global CEO through a roadmap, the family, and let's get that moving. And that's what we did. We went from an IR function of 5 to roughly, I think, 70 or 80 of us in the end. And whilst, you know, you don't want to hang your hat on the size of your team, we did go from, you know, a business of, gosh, I think roughly at the time, 5,000 to 10,000 during my tenure. By the time I left, we were roughly, I think, 4.2 billion in revenue, around sort of 450, 460 in EBITDA, depending on commodity prices, with a really strong trajectory over the following 10-year period through, you know, acquisition and some organic growth. So just a brilliant journey. Had a terrific time there, but was missing my children. I had 3 other colleagues retiring at that time, and I thought, look, I'm either going to stay here for life or I'm going to go and do something different. So I took 12 months off with the children and then started my own consulting business to have a look outside those traditional industries I'd worked in, and have done a little bit of consulting and currently consulting into the Port of Newcastle for a fantastic change initiative. So really enjoying working with them at the moment.
Amazing. I want to go straight back. I mean, there's so many things I want to ask about that immediately, but I'm going to go straight back to you calling out the brilliant CEO and the CEO relationship. Talk to me about, you know, maybe how that differed from, and not calling out other CEOs, but what was different? What does a really good CEO partnership look like?
Sure. Look, I think Mark had come from a grad program at Ford, and Ford really have those fundamentals down extremely well. So I think from that, he really learnt the importance of shaping people's careers. And his career trajectory had gone from, you know, a young engineer through the ranks of management, then through to, and I can't remember all of his stops along the way, but prior to coming over to Visy, he had been at Futurus, pardon me, which is a tier 1 supplier into the automotive industry. So had really sharpened his teeth and his career journey on building his leadership skills as much as his technical skills. And he was very quick to note that the things that had, you know, really got him to the point that he was, which was a truly commercial, very values-driven people leader, was all around the influence of others and understanding the strengths that others brought to the team, and the benefit of stepping back from the I to really progressing the we, and how you built a team with complementary skill sets. Really saw such a hockey tick in, you know, in growth and productivity, you know, together with a whole number of other tools and things along the way. But I think he really worked with some great people leaders that gave him, I suppose, the real confidence and insight into HR being a true strategic partner. And I think therefore gave me the agency to, you know, to imagine what a business like Visy with very little HR, you know, support there, what a business with those sorts of building blocks could be. I was very lucky that he had some faith in me and my strategic ability, and my communications and influencing skills to work together and build a really capable executive and really inject some fundamental people leadership skills across the business that just helped us elevate the business into a much stronger position that allowed us to make some really significant acquisitions and explore other parts of the business that perhaps hadn't have been explored before. When we step back together to have a look at the business to sort of say, look, what do we think we could do here? Where is there money on the table to be taken? And I think those things became quite obvious to us that with the right people, you didn't always necessarily have to inject, further capex or money into, building new machines or what have you, or building new plants. If we could really extract the benefits of our people and their skill sets to lift the business before you ended up having those large cash injections into new plants and whatnot. So really, he was a great visionary in that perspective and partnered well, surrounded himself with the right people, and always happy to have a conversation, really worked from the position that anything was possible. So definitely for me, one of the greatest leaders or managers that I had the great fortune to work with. And if anyone has the ability to work with him, I would strongly encourage it, and a very good human to boot.
Amazing. So, I mean, I just sit there and think how exciting as an executive, having the support, but the blank canvas
Yeah.
to really go and also, I guess, the trust to go and do those things. I'd love to know whether it was this point or whether it was at a different point, but what point did you actually realize the role could shape outcomes? So not just support outcomes, actually shape them.
To be honest, I think that was pretty early in my career, Melissa. I think, the businesses that I've worked in have valued HR, whether as a strategic function, they've always valued the voice in some way, shape, or form. And I think I've always worked with people that have a great curiosity and willingness to seek to understand your point of view and what more you can put on the table. I think I truly understood it mostly at Visy because I was finally sitting at the table at the C-suite, and having a track record of, doing what I said that I was going to do, and delivering meant that people trusted me, and trusted my voice and my opinions, to be able to try different things. And therefore, you also got the ability to access the purse strings, and to demonstrate, real value add, whether that is just in an HR function or at Visy. I was very lucky that it was far more broad than just the HR function that you get to see, touch, feel, and be accountable for. I think those demonstrated results meant that I truly did get to have, a hand on the wheel, just like the CFO, just like any head of operations, and trusted by the family, the Pratt family, to do what I said that I would do. We have very high degrees of accountability at a personal level. And I think once you demonstrate that you'll always under promise and over deliver, you get, I guess, far greater room to move from a strategic point of view, because they understand that you have a very strong respect for their investment, for their funds, for their faith in doing whatever it is that you're asking to do at the time, and helping shape and build their future and their legacy.
I remember when you and I first met, one of the things that stood out to me was how early, and you touched on it in your intro, how early you went and studied supply chain. So you really went to invest in understanding the business you were working in.
Absolutely. I think one of the key, aspects to my success is absolutely understanding the business strategy, but the levers that are open to each of those different business units, to be able to create change, or you need to be able to react very quickly, in most businesses. And I think, at Visy, it can be, depending on the business unit, very commodity driven. So if commodities are going up, then that might be fantastic in one part of the business. If they are, but that could also equally mean, you're not doing so well in another. So you need to be able to understand the different levers that those business units have open to them to pivot or move towards the tension. And I think, once we had, COVID in particular was a brilliant example. And Anthony Pratt spoke a lot to us as an executive team about those VUCA operating environments. And very early in the day that we need to understand that that was the norm now. So get used to working with these moving plates at any given time, get used to understanding them in a far greater detail than you had before, and get used to being far more comfortable with the macro economics and how that could impact the business on a day-to-day level. So I think a lot of really great learnings as to the flexibility of strategy, understanding the environment at different levels to be able to react in ways that you're more comfortable with, but still at pace. So a lot of different learnings there.
Do you think there are things about HR that are misunderstood about the role? Like, are there things that frustrate you?
Look, definitely. I think I can talk to some people, no matter my whether that be my parents' age or even some of my, my more distant relatives who still think that, we do payroll or what have you. So, you're always up against those things, but then you work with other individuals that truly understand the benefit of having a capable HR professional at their side that will lean to you to talk to you about things like, a very common one at the moment is our approach to AI and, how are we partnering at the right levels of the business to make sure that we are harnessing those capabilities and not ending up with slop, AI slop steering the business and making sure that we have the right mindsets going into those sorts of things.
How do you keep yourself relevant? I mean, you talk earlier about VUCA and the pace of change and things like that. How do you keep yourself relevant?
A lot of networking, a lot of reading. I work with some fantastic, employment lawyers and safety lawyers that are often part of bigger firms as well that have access to a lot of innovation labs and what have you. At Visy, I worked with a fantastic head of IT, David Piano, who was always brilliant in creating collaborative environments with people like Telstra or what have you that were in the front of their field so that you were always doing those elements of boundary writing. He was fantastic in allowing me to have an IT or technological business partner on my team that I used essentially as a boundary writer. We took him, I think he'd been Facebook and Google, and I would just use him to go out and have a look at what other businesses, what other sectors, etc., around the world were doing to keep on the forefront and feeding that back to us to make sure that we were getting across those new elements, those new ways of thinking. Podcasts, another fantastic one, when you're doing a lap of the tan or whatever it may be, to pop those earbuds in and listen to some other interesting and engaging, thought leaders. So I think that just comes from curiosity and being open-minded and making the most of your time and multitasking so you can have access to some of those things, because it's often, I think we touched on this in a previous conversation, it can be really difficult if you are both an executive and a mother and you're balancing all of those things. You've got to be pretty good at choosing the events that you can go to, because you're often giving up,
Something else?
the bedtime, bath time, all those sorts of things. So talking to other people about, podcasts or people they found interesting to talk to and taking some recommendations, from those individuals to make sure you are staying on top of your game.
I think of this role as, it's a role that requires incredible influencing skills
Mm.
to get things done. And I think often HR leaders could give us a masterclass in influence and stakeholder management.
Yeah.
tell me about that, and then let's shift into culture. But tell me about influencing and how you navigate that with all the relationships you've got to, you
Sure.
know, work on.
Sure. Look, I guess in some ways, I was very lucky in the businesses that I was in, that they were the sorts of businesses where you literally did put, steel cap boots on and get around town. And those are the sorts of things that I would do. I was very, very serious, and still to this day, very serious about my stakeholder mapping, who's who in the zoo and who are those influencers, and to make sure that I knew what I was talking about before I got in front of them. So in my early days, Visy's probably a good example of that. I was very deliberate with my actions and made sure that, I would be across multiple sites at different times. I would get in really early to make sure that I could touch base with people on different shifts to understand the different problems, different things that were affecting them. So that when, some of those senior managers would ask me about my thoughts on this, that, and the other, I could speak with, a sense of, genuine knowledge about what it is I had learnt about different shifts. So I think, people admire a work ethic, and they admire that you strive to understand the different elements of the business before you get in front of them with with your ideas or what have you. And when you demonstrate that very genuine curiosity, when you've got some ideas about how they can further progress their businesses, I think they're grateful. And they come back for more to ask you for your thoughts. So I think it is honestly just showing a very genuine curiosity, asking, good and meaningful questions, thinking about those things, and coming back to, I suppose, rephrase it is what you think you've learnt to demonstrate that listening. And as a result, I think people welcome you into their business units, and they will seek out your understanding because you're coming from a different prism to traditional operations, but you're still demonstrating an understanding of the numbers. You're still demonstrating an understanding of, operational issues, but you're also starting to demonstrate an understanding of the strategic pathways that their businesses are going through, so that you have the ability, to touch the business at different points, right up to board, right through to floor level. So your opinion is sought because you can bounce between those places.
Culture. So, talk about your role in shaping culture.
Yeah. Again, you don't want to say, you don't want a big note, but by the same token, I would sort of suggest that um, I've had a really large part to play in that, particularly at Visy, being the only female on the executive. And again, that's all credit to Mark DeWitt, who was very keen to make sure that we had greater diversity at those top levels, greater diversity of voice at those top levels. And I think, again, because I had spent so much time in the operation, you're in a better position to understand some of the pain points for people, not just as a female, but as a young person, as a graduate, as a young manager, a mid manager, a senior manager. And I think you can become pretty articulate in synthesizing some of those pain points. And because you have the ear of people at all levels across all, parts of the business, um, you're in a unique position to be able to talk to some of that through an HR lens that has the ability to, I guess, name some of those issues, and create really valuable, workable solutions across all levels of the business. But I think the largest learning I had from that, or any of my career really, was to make sure that you had a leader that had a genuine passion and firsthand knowledge of the benefits of creating, high performance cultures, and was happy to talk to that, champion that, and make sure they engaged an executive team that was also open to that, so that you're working as a team, as a collective, and seeing any business problems, as really an opportunity to build a culture where there was greater curiosity, where, we were starting to give people the right tools, to problem solve, to really, I guess, help people have their own agency to understand that they could make a difference as well, that we don't look to others to solve them, and that we work by, if it is to be, it's up to me and what is my place in that. And I think, that's certainly one of the ways I think we change the very siloed, male-dominated culture at Visy to being one that was far more open-minded and actively went out to source, diversification and bring those sorts of things into the company with a culture that would support that and not just close the door on it. And we did that at all levels, from co-op programs to grad programs to bringing in, when we don't have the answers, to going to work with people like, NAWO or Michelle Redfern or whoever it might be within the circle, to help us to create those environments. And very lucky also to have an owner like Fiona Gaminda, who was, so passionate about championing that space. Her husband, Ruffy,
Yeah.
similar, able to look across to his businesses, particularly in Kin Group, where he'd been very progressive with women in leadership. And for us to be able to see the benefits of, what that brought to him, including, far greater or, far better margins, and being able to talk with other businesses that had better female to male ratios, for example, to get better understandings of those businesses so that they could partner more clearly, more successfully. And I think Visy took a lot of leaves out of different books, very open to learning. And that, I think, really saw us move from maybe what perhaps could have been at some points a fairly arrogant culture to one that understood we needed to look outside and learn from others and bring some help in, to create a better workforce, a more productive workforce. And I think we've done that really successfully.
What a great journey to go on. I'd love you to just, what would be the top three things if you walk into an organization and they don't have a high performance culture
Mhm.
and you want to instill one? What would be the top three things you'd do?
I would get to know that business and put my ears on first and foremost, do some walking around, understand why they're in the position they're in. Do they want to learn, and pull some of that data, get some of that feedback, and find some of those pain points, and agree as a business that we're going to start just some pilots to see what works, and create an environment where people aren't scared about the change, where we really, look to and appreciate the brilliant things that have got us to where we are, and we want to protect those things, but also understand from all people where they think we've got opportunity to change, and start having conversations around what that might look like. And also, I think sometimes it is about bringing in some external people that can help you ask the right questions, in a manner that isn't, confrontational, that is a very seek to understand type culture, um, in a way that's not confronting, and help those businesses articulate what they think good looks like. Because, best practice is different to every individual, to every business. And I think you've really got to understand what best practice looks like for whatever business it is that you're going into, to be able to help them craft what is best for them.
Mm. I love when you were talking about that. You were making me think of, and I interviewed this person, but Rose Fass, who wrote a book called Chocolate Conversations. Don't know if you've ever come across it, but she talks a lot about one of the reasons it's hard to get strategy implemented is because words have different meanings to people.
Mm.
And it's what you're talking about there. You're really listening to get an understanding of the organization's language and then get people on the same page with that language so that they can start to move in a direction. Very good. If I think about then, looking forwards to, 2030, 2040 or whatever, and thinking about the capability executives are going to need, what do you think is going to separate effective leaders from those that aren't? And I guess what are you personally doing to help leaders build that capability?
I think it'll be a lot about curiosity. I think people's ability to be curious as to what's next and stay ahead of the curve, but in a very humanistic way as well. I think that's one lesson that we continue to learn, from AI, is about putting people at, front and center of any change program that we're moving with. And I think that change, as we spoke of previously, is going to be something that is just, constant now. And I think creativity is a skill that, if I look back at my day at school, it was a skill that was probably less promoted. It was more about academics, rote learning, and
Yes.
those things get you so far, but they are certainly not the things that are going to, get you to stand out from the rest. But again, I will circle back to that curiosity. I think it is about asking the right questions. And I think that's often more important than moving into at any time, solutions. But asking the right questions, being able to boundary ride, being curious, and getting out there to see what other people are doing are all the sorts of things that will keep people ahead. I got into the habit a year or so ago now of where I'd read interesting things on LinkedIn, or I would meet interesting people through others. And I got into the habit of just making 2 calls a week out of the blue to people that I hadn't met before. They didn't necessarily have anything to do with my practice as an HR executive. But just because I thought they were interesting, or the work that they did was interesting.
Mm.
And I've been something that I've continued to do, because it really does take you down different, I guess, rabbit burrows
Yeah.
that you can always pull back to having some benefit, or helping you progress in your own, career, and something that people are very happy to do. So I think curiosity still remains at the forefront, together with those communication and influencing skills.
I'm going to stay with that for a minute, Amy, because that's fabulous. You and I, before we turned the camera on this morning, we were talking about people are inherently good and people are inherently happy to help. Now, you're living that as well by reaching out to these people. Have any of them said to you, I'm far too busy to talk to you?
I haven't had that from one.
No.
Look, there might have been one or two on LinkedIn, and I think, look, LinkedIn, people can be very wary that you're often trying to sell them
Tell them
something.
something. Yeah.
But certainly people where I have approached them, directly, where I've been clever enough to be able to get a phone number or an email address, I haven't had anybody
Mm.
say no. And there are a number of those relationships that I'm continuing to hold moving forward, where I'm bouncing ideas off. I had, a very clever lady. I'm not sure if you've ever come across Mim Bartlett, but
Yes, I know Mim. Yeah.
she is a brilliant, brilliant woman, Mim. And Mim spoke to me once about her concept of having your own board. If you have your own business, you make sure that you've got all of those vital bases covered. But we generally don't do that as an individual, as a human. So not necessarily just as a professional, but as a human, as a mother, or any of those roles that you play. And that was really powerful to me. And I think broadening that lens of, rather than just looking in my professional life for people that might help me bridge whatever gap or satisfy whatever, area of curiosity, opening up that idea of having my own board, where I've got my own, CFO that I might go to talk to, but help me understand, the macroeconomics of this and how that converts to microeconomics, within my business unit or within my home and your own share portfolio. I think that ethos of having a board, a personal board, has been a really strong one. Mm,
I can tell what a deeply curious person you are. So, it's no surprise your career has been as successful as it is. And I love how that curiosity is just keeping you exploring new and building new relationships and connections. It's an area that so many female leaders are uncomfortable to kind of reach out. And I think you've really demonstrated also that strong story coming through about you won't get all the answers inside your own business.
that's
You know,
right.
you Got to be out there looking. What do you think? I just want to ask you a question about leadership. What do you think gets mistaken for leadership potential, and what should we be paying attention to?
I think often the loudest voice in the room, or the room that speaks, the voice that speaks first or last. And I think I've worked with plenty of people that talk with authority or speak with a tone of authority that don't necessarily have the experience and are, can actually be quite narrow-minded, or not necessarily have the breadth of knowledge of, in subject matter. Um, I think, it's really up to you to ask the questions and to create an environment where you are making sure that everybody has a voice.
Mm.
Um, I think that has been the biggest lesson that I have learnt. It is about, I suppose, seeking to understand the environments that your team or others work best in, and trying to foster that at every opportunity to bring out the best of those people and help those individuals, whether it be it's just a lack of confidence, or whether it be that those individuals just don't feel comfortable, or they've been spoken over the top of multiple times, so can't get a
Mm.
word in edgewise, which is often the case. Just making sure you're creating the space for them to have room to talk, to express an idea, and do that in completeness without being shut down. Um, I think that would be one of the greatest lessons that I've learned.
Mm. So, hot tips for young, upcoming chief people officers. What should they be focusing on?
If there's an opportunity to hold a P&L role, on your way up, do it. Create your own board, your own personal board that you go to get advice. Make sure you have really strong mentors and sponsors, and mix them up. You don't have to have one for a lifetime. You can grow and spread. And I think the other thing, the really important thing, is to network. I didn't do that very well at all earlier on in my career for a number of reasons. Long hours, a lot of travel, and when you've got a family on top of that, I think women in particular really struggle to establish that network. But it's never too late. And to the point, we were talking about earlier, um, people love to help. And I also think, good women will always go out of their way to support other good women, good men too. And
Mm.
there are a lot of those around these days, a lot of those around. I think there's a far greater awareness, that what is good for women is good for men. And it is truly a partner, truly a partnership. And I think, I was very fortunate, as I mentioned, having Mark DeWitt, who understood the benefits. And I've worked with some other great men that have had very strong sisters or female role models that understand the benefits for you as an individual selfishly in helping other people get a leg up because you are learning from them. But I do think draw out that stakeholder map, build your own board, understand the P&L and the macroeconomics so that you can truly understand the micro, and you're on a pretty good path to success.
Brilliant. The final question I ask everybody is, from your perspective, what does brave feminine leadership mean, and do you think it needs to change?
I think those things naturally evolve. I think brave feminine leadership really is about calling out behaviors or cultures that aren't working, because that can be really intimidating sometimes. And I think, I've always worked with the idea that you need to move towards the tension, look at it as a process, call it out, but have a solution at hand, or um, don't put that person in the spotlight in a negative way. Help them reframe. I think what you meant was, and there are some fabulous people that do that, on LinkedIn, that can talk to, how you can do that better than what I'm calling out. Um, but I do think it's important to move towards the tension, whether you're doing that at the time or whether you're circling back around and having a discussion with those individuals to talk to them about how that made you feel, or possibly how that made other people feel, without belittling them or publicly humiliating them. But I think, it's a moving towards attention is something that has always worked well for me, so long as it's done in a respectful way.
Thank you so much for joining the conversation, Amy. It's been brilliant talking with you.
Thanks, Melissa. You too.